me start the recording. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to say about polling is that it's a way of measuring public opinion. The most critical piece is whether sampling techniques are done randomly and in a statistically correct manner. It's called, pollsters and opinion researchers call it drawing a sample. And if your sample, this is difficult to do because samples have to be weighted. In other words, opinion researchers have to determine a sample that is exactly the same as the population either in the country or the state or in a particular election. So that if the sample is not fully and wholly representative of those who participate in an election, vote in an election, or those who live in a community or a state, depending on what, or a nation, then the poll will not be accurate. And one of the reasons in the 2012 election, one of the reasons that Mitt Romney's polls were off was because the sample that was being used was incorrect. So I know there are people out there that still haven't accepted the fact that science and math are real. And there are people out there who say, oh, it's just impossible. How can you have a survey sample of 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 people that accurately reflect the opinion of an entire nation of over 300 million people? But the answer is, if the sample is drawn right, that is totally representative of the body whose opinion you're trying to get, you can come pretty close. And so what this chart shows is that, for example, most opinion polls in national politics usually run 1,000 or maybe 1,500 people in terms of the sample size. So what this chart shows is the following. Let's just take 1,000 or 1,500 people being surveyed. What this chart shows is that if 1,000 to 1,500 people are surveyed in a poll, the margin of error in that poll will be plus or minus 3%, with a 95% confidence level. What that means in English is that the margin of error in the poll can be no more than plus or minus 3, 95 times out of 100. Okay? That means 5 times out of 100, the margin of error will be greater. But that's what this means. So if you poll 100 people, the margin of error is 10 plus or minus 10%. If you poll 2,000 people, the margin of error is plus or minus 2. So the question is, what concretely does margin of error mean? Because come election time, on TV or in the newspaper, you can find poll results. And so I'm giving you a couple of examples so that when you see poll results in campaigns and elections, you will understand what they mean. First of all, it's important to understand that while professional pollsters may not be interested in using polls to influence future voter behavior, the political parties and candidates also use polling. They have their own polling, and they do want polls to try to influence future voter behavior in a way that benefits them. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. Say You have candidate A with 46%, candidate B with 42%, and undecided 12% with a margin of error of plus or minus 3. Concretely, what this means, who do you think is ahead here between candidate A and candidate B with a margin of error of plus or minus 3?
Candidate B.
Say louder.
A.
Nope. Neither one. Here's why. What margin of error plus or minus 3 means is that candidate A could have as many as 49% of the vote or as low as 43% of the vote. Candidate B could have as much as 45% of the vote or as low as 39% of the vote. So if, in fact, candidate B has 45% of the vote and candidate A has 43% of the vote, in fact, candidate B is actually ahead, even though it appears that candidate A is ahead. Similarly, if candidate A has 51% of the vote and candidate B 48%, and the margin of error is plus or minus 4, candidate A's vote might actually be, at least in the sample that's drawn, as low as 47% of the vote. Candidate A's percentage could be as low as 47% of the vote, and candidate B could be as high as 52. So the margin of error and the degree of confidence are especially important in determining what a poll actually means. To say that one candidate has 46%, another has 42%, by the way, even without the margin of error, if it's 46 to 42 and they're 12% undecided, you cannot assume that those undecided voters that are sampled are going to split precisely like the way the other 88% split. So the margin of error is critical in showing exactly what the status of a campaign is and what the status of the opinion about the candidates is. Any comments or questions about this? Most polls, keep in mind, are in the range of 1,000 to 1,500. It's expensive to do polling. It costs money. And candidates always need and want more money. So the chance is that most polling, at least especially that done by candidates and parties, will be plus or minus 3. Any comments or questions about this? Okay. So polls can be pretty accurate. One of the older polling organizations is the George Gallup organization, and you can see that its record is pretty close. The election results are in a kind of orangish brown, and I don't know how it looks to you, and the green is their final survey. So it can be pretty close. We talked earlier about the question of are people satisfied or dissatisfied about the direction of the country, and I think it's fair to say that at this point in our history, these graphs suggest it, the public sector institutions, Supreme Court, public schools, Congress, especially Congress. Actually, Congress's favorability rating is under 10%. It's as low as it's ever been, but that's true for most governmental institutions. Not that it's under 10%, but that it's at its close at or close to its low points. And religious organizations and military organizations tend to have greater people tend to have greater confidence in. You can see that big business on the right, that big business, organized labor, and TV news ranked pretty low. Well, technology has changed opinion polling, and telephone polling has become much more common. It used to be door to door, and then with everyone having a telephone, it became the new standard, even though many times people were at work or out and so couldn't be reached. Cell phones change the polling game and make it more difficult for the following reason. Generally speaking, those under 30, if they have their own home or their own apartment, probably are more likely to have a cell phone than a landline. And so if polls are done in a way that excludes cell phones, that introduces a bias into the sample. And it's going to be, among other things, an age bias. Because most people have cell phones, but not everybody has landlines. And most younger people, my children, for example, one is 37, one is 31. They, thank God, don't live with me. But they have their own places, and neither one has a landline. I suspect that's pretty common. So if an opinion poll is conducted on the basis of telephone polling with regard to landlines, then it's not going to be accurate. And those who are going to be underrepresented are those who are in younger age groups. How do parties and candidates and the media use polls? Well, candidates and parties use polls because they need to craft a message. I hate to say this. It hurts me to say this. But in our political world today, with the forms of technology that are available to candidates and the heavy media emphasis in political campaigns, candidates are often marketed like soap or like cars. What do people want? What do people like to hear? How do I, as a candidate, put together a message that will resonate with enough voters so that I can win? Because ultimately, bottom line, there are two issues in a campaign, in an election. One is, who is voting? We call that turnout. And the other is, what's the composition of that turnout? And I need to find, as a candidate, 50% plus that are going to vote for me, and I need to craft a message that'll help create that positive resonance. So candidates and parties seek to identify the message that will work. They seek to identify positive and negative voter demographics, meaning which groups of people are going to vote for me or for our party, which are more likely to vote against, and to craft a message accordingly. Media also does polling, And they do polling generally for a different reason. Media often gives the impression, and sometimes it does, of trying to educate voters, provide or present news about campaigns. But media is mostly interested, at least the mainstream media is mostly interested in turning elections into horse races. Anybody ever been to a horse race? It's pretty exciting. And people yell. The first time I went to a racetrack was in California, and at Santa Anita, and the horses came down literally on grass off of a hill into the track, and I never heard yelling like that in my life. People are excited. So horse races generate eyeballs, and eyeballs for TV networks are important because if the more eyeballs there are, the more advertising dollars they can obtain from selling ads on their stations. And the case of the 2008 Democratic primaries is a wonderful example of this problem. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were the two major candidates as the Democratic primaries developed. And Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in something like 12 or 13 or 14, I'm not quite sure of the number, primary elections in a row. Okay? And yet, mainstream TV was still trying to say this was a close race. This was not a close race. Not after 13 or so primary victories by one candidate over another. It was a done deal. Yet it was not in the interest of the networks to say, even though there are going to be a few more primary elections, this is a done deal and the candidate is going to be Obama. And why do they do that? Because if the minute they say, oh, it's determined, the candidate, the nominee is going to be X, Y, or Z, people turn off the set. Candidates and parties in the media also use focus groups. These are more personal, group-based, smaller conversations which are led by opinion researchers. Sometimes they're on TV. You'll probably see them in the early days of the next presidential primary season. Focus groups gather maybe 10, 15, 20 people, and they have for an hour or so a conversation, maybe 2 hours, about the candidates and about the campaign, what they like about it, what they don't, how they react to certain themes, topics, etc. And so parties and candidates often use focus groups to see in a very, personal way what resonates with voters. Any comments? There are also, I don't know why this is this way, but it is. I do know why it is, and I forgot to do this, but so internet polling is generally unscientific. They're really not polls at all. First of all, while many people, the majority of American people have access to the internet, not all do. So they're not really truly representative. They're not scientific polls in any manner. So you should not, be under the delusion that a poll on the internet means anything except that's who showed up and voted. I'm going to talk about political ideology because that's part of public opinion and political attitude, but first I want to see if there are any comments or questions. Okay. So this is more difficult than talking about public opinion. Political ideology is defined, at least by most political scientists, in the following manner. I might add that the guy who first started writing about ideology, at least in American political science, in the last 50, 60 years, is a gentleman named Philip Converse, who is at the University of Michigan. And he defined political ideology as a relatively consistent and stable set of interrelated beliefs and values about the proper purpose and scope of government and politics. So someone who is ideological on this definition has to have public policy views that are or are understood to be logically coherent and interrelated or correlated. In essence, ideology is a method of systematically simplifying politics by knowing what goes with what. What environmental issue goes with this economic issue? What social issue goes with this issue of foreign policy, etc. So it's a coherent, consistent way of thinking about politics, usually based on a set of beliefs and or values. If you look at the work of historians and the work of American historians and the work of political scientists, they will argue that most will argue that Americans tend not to have strong belief systems when it comes to politics, which is to say they don't act or think ideologically. Some people, a minority, have fixed preferences and answer survey questions consistently, but most tend to give random answers. So most people, political scientists have found, do not interpret politics through an ideological lens. Keep in mind, last time we talked about different factors that influence voting behavior. The candidate, the impression of the candidate, issues, and what was the third? I'm forgetting. Candidate, issues, and I have to go back and look. I don't remember. That's terrible. Give me an F. And what we said at the time, nonetheless, that most voters don't put issues at the top of the list. Whoops. Okay, so democratic theory assumes that voters in the mass public hold clear ideological views, and that those views then allow them to make voting decisions based on the candidate policy positions. In other words, Converse argues that in a democracy, there are elections, and there are candidates, and candidates have policy positions, and voters have policy views, and they then vote for the candidate or candidates that best represent or most accurately represent the issue views, their issue views. And it's presumed that voters evaluate candidates or parties' positions on the liberal-conservative ideological spectrum, so that when the electorate chooses different ideologies, it's often assumed that, or candidates with different ideologies, it's often assumed that the electorate is becoming more conservative or more liberal. Political science research says this isn't what happens. and that most Americans don't have a whole lot of interest in politics. They don't have a lot of knowledge about politics, and that they tend not to be ideological. So if Converse is correct, that about democratic theory and what democracies entail, that is, elections with candidates with different views, policy views, and voters who have policy views, and then make voting decisions based on the similarity between candidates and their own policy views. If that's what democracy is, he says we fail. We don't meet the expectations of democratic theory. It should be noted, Converse doesn't talk about this, but many Americans are consistently subjected to misinformation about American government and politics, and God knows everything else in the world. And in part, we can thank the internet for that. And the misinformation has become so pervasive that there are now online media and candidate fact-check websites, and they're both partisan websites, which probably aren't too good at fact-checking, but they're nonpartisan and professional and academic websites that are fact-checkers that are probably more reliable. So I wanted to give you the results of a survey done by a University of Maryland research center on just one example of media misinformation about politics. And by no means am I suggesting that this is in any way unique. So PIPA did a study in 2010 of those who watch and don't watch Fox News. So this study was done 4 years ago. And so what the study found was that those who watched Fox News almost daily were significantly more misinformed than the rest of the American population. And this was true regardless of whether the people watching Fox News were Democrats or Republicans, though Republicans tended to be somewhat more misinformed than Democrats. But in each case, both were more misinformed than the rest of the population. So they believed, again, this is 2010, that most economists estimated the stimulus that was enacted in 2009 caused job losses. They were 12% more likely to believe that, even though it was false. They believe that most economists have estimated the health care law will worsen the deficit by 31 points or percentage points more likely to believe that. That also was, the estimates were mischaracterized, and in fact it didn't work. That hasn't worsened the deficit at all. Quite the contrary. They believe the economy in 2010 was getting worse from when it was in 2007, 8, and 9. That was also false. They believe that most scientists do not agree that climate change is occurring. The difference between Fox News watchers and the general public was 30 percentage points. Stimulus legislation did not include tax cuts, 14 percentage points. Their own income tax went up, another 14 points. The auto bailout occurred only under Obama, 13 percentage point difference. And I'll skip the TARP just to move on, and that it's not clear that Obama was born in the United States. 30 percentage point difference between Fox News watchers and the rest of the population that didn't watch Fox News. And I mean, there's no other way to put this. This is staggering misinformation. There's no other way to gloss it over. What in bold terms, what this says, at least with respect to these issues at that time, watching Fox News made people politically stupid. I think you could probably put together a similar survey that would show that maybe some others do as well. It would be, I think, inaccurate to simply blame the media on misinformation, because candidates and political ads and so on are also very good at misinforming people. Nonetheless, this study showed that people who had greater exposure to news sources were generally better informed than those who didn't. Those with higher, and in most cases, those with higher levels of exposure to news sources had lower levels of misinformation, though that was not always the case. So, if somebody in the class can bring up this, if you've got a computer that you all can see, and you can bring up this link on YouTube, is that something you guys can do?
Yes. Which video did you want them to watch?
Pardon?
Which video did you want them to watch?
I couldn't hear.
Just click on the link. Just on the link. Well, I tried to go to it. I tried to go to that link this morning and it wouldn't let us go to it. So which video did you want them to watch?
Oh my, okay. All right, let me do this. Hang on a second. If you go to YouTube on your computer,
And then what?
Okay. Go to YouTube and type in quotes, the following. Language, quote, language complaints, quote, and then quotation, press club, 2 words, P-R-E-S-S, club, and hit return.
Quote? Like erase that. Okay, erase all that. Erase all that.
Okay, now what comes up?
It'll come up even if you don't put quotes, I'm sure.
Okay, so do you see George Carlin, Language Complaints at American Press Club? One at a time.
Yeah, just go to that one, George Carlin Language Complaints.
It's the one that says it's 9 minutes, 37 seconds. It says George Carlin can say some outrageous things years ago, and none of these filthy words are there in this. So do you have that video? And here, you got too many people talking.
It's how long? 9 minutes and 37 seconds?
Correct.
All right, we got it.
Okay. Click it, turn it on so everyone can hear it.
Now, having somewhat successfully established my press credentials, and because you and I have at least one thing in common, which is that all of us deal with language all the time, I thought it might be nice today for me to come to you with some of my language complaints. Certainly not to blame them on you, although, of course, you are implicated. And not that you didn't help it. I mean, the problem is really with the people you cover. The politicians, the celebrities, the lawyers, and although their level of insincerity is astonishing, it's still kind of fun to hear them talk. In particular, it's fun to listen to Washington talk. Whenever the issue of term limits comes up, I always tell people the only term limits I'm interested in would be to limit some of the terms used by politicians. They speak, of course, with great caution, because they must take care not to actually say anything. Proof of this, according to their own words, is that they don't actually say things that indicate them. As I indicated yesterday, and as the President indicated to me, but sometimes they don't indicate, they suggest. Let me suggest, as I indicated yesterday, I haven't determined that yet. So they don't decide, they determine. If it's a really serious matter, they make a judgment. I haven't made a judgment on this yet. When the hearings are concluded, I will make a judgment, or I might make an assessment. I'm not sure. I haven't determined that yet. But when I do, I will advise you. They don't tell, they advise. I advised him that I had made a judgment. Thus far, he hasn't responded. They don't answer, they respond. He hasn't responded to my initiative. An initiative is an idea that isn't going anywhere. When he responds to my initiative, I will review his response, take a position, and make a recommendation. So they don't read the review, they don't have opinions, they take positions, and they don't give advice, they make recommendations. And so, at long last, after each has responded to the other's initiatives, and each has reviewed the other's responses, and everyone has taken a position, made a judgment, and offered a recommendation, now they have to do something. But that would be much too direct. So instead they address the problem. We're addressing the problem and we'll soon be proceeding. That's a big activity here in Washington. Proceeding, we're always proceeding, we're moving forward. A lot of that goes on. Senator, have you solved that problem? Well, we're moving forward on that. And when they're not moving forward, they're moving something else forward, such as the process. We have to move the process forward so we can implement the provisions of the initiative in order to meet these challenges. No one has problems anymore. Challenges. That's why we need people who can make the tough decisions. Tough decisions like how much soft money can I expect to collect in exchange for my core values? So that I can continue my work in government. Of course, no politician would admit to such a lowly station as working in government, serving the nation. Serving the nation. Another favorite distortion is public service. I'm in public service. I like America, don't you? The food is great, but the public service is terrible. Now, folks, a question for you. Do you think it's possible that one of these politicians, whose judgment is so poor that he honestly thinks of himself as serving the nation, might occasionally be expected to indulge in a little patriotism? Okay? What do you think? Well, of course, not only is it possible, it's inevitable, and that's when he's at his very best. That's when he trots out the really good stuff, all across this great land of ours, the greatest nation on earth, the greatest nation in the history of the world. And in times of military crisis, you can be sure that someone in a suit in this town will eventually plant himself in front of a camera and carry on a great deal about the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Now, normally, during peacetime, the politicians will refer to people in the military as our young men and women stationed around the world. But in wartime, they quickly become our brave young fighting men and women stationed halfway around the world in places whose names they can't pronounce, wondering if they'll ever see their loved ones again. For added emotional impact, sons and daughters can always be substituted for men and women. And so I think we can sum this up by saying that when the military is concerned, the extent of a politician's insincerity can be measured by how far around the world our soldiers are stationed and whether or not any of them can pronounce it. Incidentally, another way of expressing this sentiment is to say we're sending our young men and women to places the average American can't find on the map. I've always thought it was kind of funny and somewhat out of character for a politician to go out of his way to point out the low level of American intelligence when indeed his very job depends upon it. It would seem to fly in the face of that other rhetorical standby of theirs. The American people are a lot smarter than they're given credit for. This is said with a straight face, although it is obvious, of course, that the proposition is being stated precisely backwards. But the politicians, God bless them, or something like that, they're at their most entertaining when they're in trouble. When they're in trouble, their explanations usually begin simply with words like miscommunication. What did you do wrong, Senator? Well, it was a miscommunication. Or it's pulled out of context. Better yet, and more ironic, they twisted my words. Such a nice touch. A person who routinely spends his days torturing the language complains, they twisted my words. As the controversy continues to heat up, he moves to his next level of complaint. The whole thing has been blown out of proportion. It's always the whole thing. Apparently, no one has ever claimed that only a small portion of something was blown out of proportion. It has to be the whole thing. That's because now he's feeling the heat. And so, as time passes and more evidence comes in, he suddenly changes directions and tells us, we're trying to get to the bottom of this. Now he's on the side of law and order. It's jiu-jitsu, really. We're trying to get to the bottom of this so we can get the facts out to the American people. That's always a nice touch, American people. In fact, at this point, he might even say, I'm willing to trust in the fairness of the American people. Clearly, he's preparing us for something. And so, when finally all the facts come out on our subject seems quite guilty, he employs that sublime use of the passive voice, mistakes were made. Mistakes were made, some of me, probably some in my office. Things are moving faster now. Mistakes were made is rapidly overtaken by there is no evidence. No one has proven anything. Eventually I will be exonerated. I have faith in the American judicial system and that certain sign that things are closing in. Whatever happens, innocent until proven guilty. Whatever happens. Well, he's about to find out. And we know this must be true because the next thing we hear from him is, I just want to put this thing behind me and get on with my life. I just want to put this behind me. That's an expression you hear a lot these days in all walks of life. From people in all walks of life. Usually it's her same question has committed someone to speak of life. Yes, it's true, I strangled my wife, shot the triplets, set fire to the house, and sold my young son to an old man on the train. But now I just want to put this That's the problem in this country. Too many people getting on with their lives.
Can you turn that off now?
Is ritual suicide. You know, never mind the first time. He says, get the big knife out of the drawer. Personally, what I want to do is to I want to put this thing behind me and get on with my life, thing behind me and get on with my life. I'll repeat that for you. Personally, I want to put this thing behind me and get on with my life, thing behind me and get on with my life.
Can you guys hear me? Can you turn it off now? I want one more minute to talk, and I need you to turn that off so I can do that. Okay, here's the deal. I love George Carlin. There is a tradition of criticism of political language that goes back at least as far as George Orwell, who is usually universally respected by people of almost all political persuasions. He's also a comedian, not Orwell, but Carlin is clearly a comedian, and what comedians do, some of them, is to make fun of all kinds of folks. In this case, he's picking on politicians. Those aren't his only targets in his work, in the body of his work. The thing I don't like about this piece is that really what Carlin is suggesting is that all politicians are corrupt and awful. And I don't want to suggest that. But I want to interpret for our purposes what he's saying in a different light. And that is that political language, the language used by people in public office, people campaigning for public office, is often used to obscure and or misinform about American government. That, to me, is the lesson of the Carlin video. It's important to listen very carefully carefully to what people in politics say and how they use the language. And I'm going to use a fairly extreme analogy. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you have cancer, I think you're going to pay pretty close attention to what that physician tells you you need to do in order to deal with the condition that has been identified. I don't think you're just going to not pay any attention. I think you're going to pay close attention. I would suggest to you that if the American people use the same degree of attentiveness to the language and the misinformation that comes out of the mouths of many, not all, but many political figures, you would be, and we would be, as a country, a lot better off. I am not saying that politicians lie. I think most of the time politicians, in fact, do not lie. They're not awful people. But they do use language in a way that doesn't help us understand American government and politics. See you on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend.